Hello everyone, welcome to the Var Valley podcast. The word Var is short for the French word varier, which means a person who varies. This channel is a spin-off of the History Valley podcast, which is where I spend much of my time interviewing mainstream scholars. Over here, however, I and the co-host of this channel, DJ Shonsky, interview a variety of alternative scholars who have radically different views from the mainstream. That being said, I'll provide the following disclaimer. I am not convinced by any of the people that are being interviewed here on Var Valley, and my views may not align with the views of DJ Shonsky. I am simply curious to figure out why they believe the things that they believe, and it does not represent my views in any way, shape, or form. Thank you.
Well, good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to the Var Valley podcast. I'm your host, DJ Shonsky. I'm here again with Emmet Sweeney. Today's topic is, did the Trojan War really happen? And we hear a lot about the mythology of Agamemnon and the Trojan Wars in the movie Troy. It is looked at as mythology. We're here today to clear the air with Emmet Sweeney as to whether or not this is fact or fiction. Emmet, thanks for coming on the show again. Appreciate you.
Thanks for having me, Sean.
Take it away, Emmet.
Right, Sean, thank you. The question of Greek legend and Greek tradition is impacted by the whole question of chronology, the question mark hanging over chronology. And it's radically impacted also by Gunnar Heinsson's thesis, central thesis, that the chronology of sorry, could you excuse me for 1 minute? My brother has just come in, and I just want to say, just tell him what's happening. He didn't know what was happening. Sorry about this.
All right, that's fine. That's fine. So in the meantime, sorry for the delay, everyone. I want to thank everyone for subscribing to the channel. It's very much appreciated. Right now, we're up to 379 subscribers. Last year at this time, we didn't have that many, of course. And I also like to again thank Emmet for his continued cooperation with the show. It started off again with Gunnar Heinsohn interviews, and with the passing of Gunnar Heinsohn, Emmet Sweeney essentially is next man up. He has written books on chronology. He's also cited in other people's works about chronology. So he's back with us, and this is impromptu, like we always say. We just go right off the cuff and just let it hang out. But Emmet is back with us again. Did the Trojan War really happen? Is the topic of discussion today. You can start over again, Emmet. It's not a problem.
Right. Thank you, Sean. Sorry about that. Right. Yeah, the question of Greek legend, Greek tradition, with regard to the Trojan War and various other events of early Greek tradition, is impacted by the whole question mark hanging over chronology. One of the things that Gunnar Heinsohn emphasized is that the chronology of Greek, Mycenaean Greece, that's Greece before the classical epoch, Greece at the time of, it's alternatively called the Age of Heroes or the Mycenaean Age, the heroic age of the Mycenaean Age, which was the period of, in which we place the Trojan War, mainly because King Agamemnon, who led the Greeks at Troy, was the king of Mycenae. And so the whole Mycenaean epoch is dated according to Egyptian chronology. Let me go back in time a little bit to kind of explain things. Up until the late 19th century, 1880s, something like that, the whole story of Troy was regarded as purely legendary, purely mythical. There were certain romantic personages who disagreed. One of these being a German entrepreneur, as it turned out, called Heinrich Schliemann. As a young boy, he had been enthralled by the stories which he had read in popular literature, and I think he had read the Iliad as well. I don't know, not in the original Greek. although he later could read Greek. But as a boy, he had read the Iliad in translation, and he had read popular retellings of Greek legend and myth. And his imagination was fired by this. And with that intent, with the intention, he intended very early in his life to actually prove these stories true. And so with that in mind, he actually became a rich man. He became a very wealthy businessman and supplied himself with the means to fulfill his ambition. So around the 1880, 86, I think it was, he went out to Turkey, was modern Turkey, or Asia Minor as it was called in ancient times, to the region of the Dardanelles where Troy was traditionally placed. And he went to a mound, a hill, which is nowadays called Hisarlik, and he began to excavate. And sure enough, he discovered an ancient city there, which was inhabited until Roman times. And from Latin inscriptions and Greek inscriptions, it became clear that this was the site of Troy. So he dug deep, very, very deep into the mound, and he found city after city on top of each other. And he found a great treasure near the bottom, the second bottom city, I think Troy 2, he called it. And sort of a great treasure of gold and silver and electrum, which he called the treasure of King Priam, king of Troy during the famous siege. And so he was hailed as the discoverer of Troy. So crowned with this success, he went to Greece itself. He sailed over the Aegean Sea, and he went to the site of Mycenae, King Agamemnon's capital. Now that had never been lost because the huge walls, the Cyclopean walls, still stood, and you could still see the top of the famous Lion Gate, which was the main entrance to the citadel. There was a great gate composed of three sort of a massive carved blocks of stone, and at the top of the gate there, and on the lintel, there was a relief carving of two rampant lions standing between a pillar. So he began excavating in Mycenae. And now, some of the ancient authors, I think it was Pausanias, said that King Agamemnon had been buried right within the citadel, just beside the Lion Gate. So you entered through the Lion Gate, and just to the right, it was claimed that there was a grave circle. And in pits in this grave circle, King Agamemnon and his entourage were buried after they'd been murdered by his wife, Clytemnestra. As some listeners might know, Agamemnon was murdered shortly after his return by his wife, who had meantime taken a lover during the absence of the king, the long absence. Anyway, Schliemann and his team began to excavate this site. Sure enough, they soon discovered marker stones for a grave circle. And about 8 to 10 feet down, I think it was, they discovered these incredibly rich burials. There was several men who were obviously warriors or princes. Their faces were covered with golden face masks, and by their sides were richly decorated swords and other weapons. There were several women there, and there was children as well. All of them buried with some marks of status and wealth. And famously, the richest and most impressive of the golden face masks, Schliemann claims he lifted off the face of the body, and the air or the oxygen, no oxygen had actually touched or been able to get to this the corpse underneath. And he says it was perfectly preserved. He says he could even see the bristles on the man's beard. But as the oxygen began to do its work, the face began to disintegrate. So very much kind of moved, Schliemann famously telegraphed the king of Greece in Athens, saying, "I have looked upon the face of King Agamemnon." Now, at the beginning, shortly, of course, this made headlines all around the world, and Schliemann was credited with proving the whole story of Troy and King Agamemnon and the Greek expedition true. However, in the grave circle, it's now called Grave Circle A, he also discovered Egyptian objects, and these clearly dated to the early 18th dynasty. Right at the beginning of the 18th dynasty, which was the great imperial period of Egyptian history. Tutankhamun belonged to the 18th dynasty, near the end of it, actually. The greatest conquering pharaoh of Egypt at the time in its history lived at that time, Thutmose III. So Flinders Petrie was one of probably the foremost Egyptologist in the world at that time, an Englishman. And he quickly put a damper on the celebrations, on Schliemann's celebrations. He said that the 18th dynasty objects in the burial in the grave pit proved beyond question that these objects and these burials had to be dated to the 16th, around the late 16th century BC, so 1550 or something like that, 1520. At the latest, in fact, 1500. Whereas, as Petrie says, everybody knows the Trojan War happened around 1200 BC. So Petrie was saying that the bodies in this grave circle dated to 300 years before the Trojan War. So there was something of a dispute at the time. Not everybody accepted that, and people were reluctant to let go of the notion that this was indeed the grave of Agamemnon and his dynasty. After all, Schliemann had found the bodies by following ancient tradition, and ancient tradition had said that they were there, and sure enough, they were there. Why was there any reason to doubt that these were in fact the bodies of the men that the ancients believed? Without these burials, without this discovery, there was no real evidence that Agamemnon or any of these people ever existed. Anyway, in the end, the Egyptologists prevailed. They claimed that they had an iron cast chronology and that nothing could question it. It was based on astronomy. I would say astrology is more like it. But anyway, they claimed it was scientifically based and that it couldn't be questioned. And they could date Egyptian pharaohs down to the last year, even naming the day and the month in which they were crowned, some of them. So eventually, somewhat crestfallen, Schliemann and the rest of the Romantics conceded defeat, and the golden face mask that Schliemann removed from the body of the most magnificent burial is now called the so-called mask of Agamemnon, because it's accepted that this was in fact the burial of some king dated hundreds of years before the Trojan War, and some nameless king whose name and whose identity we'll never be sure of. And furthermore, it is claimed that there's still no evidence that the Trojan War actually happened. Now, that's things as they stand. According to the stratigraphic work of Gunnar Heinsohn and myself and various other people, Egyptian chronology has no scientific basis whatsoever. The 18th dynasty was in fact contemporary with the Mitanni or the Mita or the Mede Empire. Therefore, it cannot date to the 15th, 14th century BC. It must be 700 years younger than that, because the Medes were the great power which preceded the rise of the Persian Empire in the middle of the 6th century BC. And the Medes were in power for not much more than a century or a century and a half. In other words, the 18th dynasty must date to the 7th, maybe the latter 8th, 7th century, not to the 15th and 16th centuries. Now, that has a profound impact on the question of Greek history, because if the 18th dynasty began around, as I believe, and I have argued in great detail in various publications, if the 18th dynasty actually began around 740, 730 BC, remember, contemporary with the Empire of the Medes, then that's where those burials in Mycenae have to be dated. But is there any evidence that the Trojan War occurred at such a late date, around 720, 730, 740 BC? Well, the evidence that this is true is overwhelming. I'll just touch on a few of the more important indicators in that direction. First and foremost, Homer mentions that the Phrygians were allies and contemporaries of the Trojan War. King Midas of Phrygia, Midas of the Golden Touch and the ass's ears, is recognized as his historical character of the late 8th century. Yet Homer casually mentions that King Midas was a contemporary and an ally of Troy. On his way from Troy, the Trojan hero Aeneas puts in at Carthage before he eventually reaches Italy and allegedly founds Rome. Rome was founded traditionally in the 8th century, in the late 8th century. Carthage was founded around the 8th or very earliest, the 9th century. So Aeneas could not have found any city of Carthage in the 12th century BC, in which he could have, and he fell in love, or Queen Dido of Carthage fell in love with Aeneas, according to Virgil, the Roman poet. So Aeneas could not have visited the city of Carthage in the 12th century because it didn't exist in the 12th century. The archaeology at Carthage, archaeologists working in Carthage have proven that there's no evidence really of any Carthage in existence before about the 8th century. 900 at the max, very earliest. 800 BC at the very earliest, but probably a bit later. So 750 BC, something like that. So the Aeneas from Troy couldn't have visited Carthage, a city which didn't exist. He couldn't have visited Carthage around 1200 BC if Carthage didn't exist until about 750 BC. Palamedes, one of the Greeks who was present at Troy, according to legend, inserted some of the letters of the Phoenician alphabet he added 3 extra letters. Now, the whole question of the alphabet, the Greek alphabet, is recognized as a derivative of the Phoenician alphabet. Again, there is no evidence of any alphabet either in Phoenicia or in Greece before the 7th or 8th century. Cadmus, the Greek hero who fled from Phoenicia and brought the alphabet to Greece, was supposed to have lived 5 generations before the Trojan War. But that can't have happened much before 800 BC because there's no real evidence of any alphabetic script of the type that the Phoenicians used. And remember, the Greek alphabet is very, very closely modeled on the Phoenician alphabet. So how could Cadmus, the hero who brought the alphabet from Phoenicia to Greece, who lived 5 generations before the Trojan War, and who, if he brought the alphabet, if the legend of whether Cadmus existed or not, the fact that the alphabet, by tradition, was supposed to have existed before the beginning of the Trojan War. So the Trojan War cannot have occurred much before 750 BC. the Phoenicians themselves figure very prominently in the story of Troy. And again, the Phoenicians didn't become a great seafaring nation until around 800 or 900 maximum. There was no real evidence of any Phoenician expansion across the Mediterranean before that. So again, evidence of various kinds all indicate very, very strongly that the Trojan War cannot have occurred. The context of the Trojan War, now whether the Trojan War existed, and I'll bring forth evidence shortly to prove that it did exist, and that we actually have contemporary records of it. But those records have not been properly understood because of the distorted chronology. But the fact is, the context of the Trojan War cannot be dated any earlier than the late 8th century BC, something maybe like between 740 and 700 BC. So where does this leave us? Now, I need to bring in the question at this point of the Hittite kingdom and the Hittite empire, because this also figures in the whole search for the historical Troy, and it's an incredibly dramatic story when the evidence is fully understood and the chronology is put correct. We have in our possession already some of the most sensational documents ever discovered from ancient times, but they have been completely misinterpreted and misrepresented because of the distorted chronology. And again, we found that again and again and again in Egyptian history, in Persian history, in Babylonian history, incredible evidence from the past confirming everything the Greek authors and the ancient authors said has been misinterpreted and misrepresented because of this distorted chronology. And one by one, all of the legends, the traditions of the Greeks, of the Babylonians, of the Persians, of the Egyptians have had to be discounted and declared to be fictitious because this distorted chronology has wrecked the history of the ancient world.
You're very interesting. Do you want to go to any slides at this point?
Maybe we could show an image of the mask of Agamemnon. Do you have one there, Sean?
I do. Give me a second.
It's now called the so-called mask of Agamemnon, but I believe it was either of Agamemnon himself or one of his. So this is the famous golden face mask of Agamemnon, which Schliemann fervently believed to cover the face of the legendary king of Mycenae, who led the Trojan War, led the Greek forces against Troy in the Trojan War. As I say, it's now called the so-called Mask of Agamemnon. Do you have a picture of the Lion Gate of Mycenae where the?
I do.
So here we can see the two rampant lions between the pillar and the Cyclopean masonry. The Greeks of classical and later times called this masonry, these giant blocks of stone, Cyclopean, or because it was popularly believed in folk tradition that these had been built by the Cyclops, these giants. So it's an incredibly colorful mythology in Greece, and brought to light by discoveries. The other interesting thing about this Mycenaean art is that it's heavily influenced by Crete and Cretan art. Do you have any illustrations of Knossos in Crete?
I'm not sure. I have the Hittite capital. I know that.
Yeah.
When you start talking about the Hittites, that's why I wanted to.
The Hittites are more important in terms of verification of the truth of the historicity, I suppose, of the Trojan War. Here we are. That's the Lion Gate at Hattusa. Yes.
Right.
So they also have a lion gate with the lions in a slightly different position. Now, Hattusa or Hattusas was one of the capitals of the so-called Hittite Empire. Now, the Hittites were also contemporaries of the Egyptian 18th dynasty, the 18th and 19th dynasties. The Hittites, the Hittite Empire rose to power shortly after roughly at the same time as the 18th dynasty of Egypt and the Mitanni kingdom, or the Mita, as we call it, the Mede kingdom of Iran and northern Mesopotamia, the kingdom of the Medes. So the Hittites again were discovered. This empire of this. It was actually proclaimed as a lost empire or a forgotten empire. They discovered a great archive in Hattusa. Hattusas is right in the middle of what we modern Turkey, Anatolia, on the river that the ancients called the Halys River. And the very early travelers from Europe noted ancient carvings, bas reliefs, etc., all over Anatolia in a style of art which was quite unique, somewhat reminiscent, I suppose, of the Egyptian art or Babylonian art, but different in its own way. So it was a unique art form. And it was often wondered, what culture, what civilization produced these artist pieces of art, these carvings, etc. It was noted also that they were accompanied by cuneiform writing. Now, cuneiform or wedge-shaped writing was recognized quite early as having originated in Mesopotamia and Babylonia. And so obviously the Anatolia, or as I say, modern Turkey, was heavily influenced by Mesopotamia, by ancient Mesopotamia, by Babylonia, Chaldea, or Sumeria, as it's now called. Anyway, towards the end of the 19th century, excavation was undertaken around the most impressive remains in Anatolia at a place now called Boghaskoy in modern Turkish. But it was found to be the site of an ancient city called Hattusas. And it was clear that this empire, one of the names that the people in this region used for themselves was Hatti. And these were the Hatti people mentioned frequently in Egyptian texts, which Egyptologists were already familiar with, and mentioned in cuneiform documents from Babylonia, the Hatti people, or Hittites, as they were known in the Bible and biblical texts. So as the excavators continued, it was found that this was a great capital city with huge walls, etc., and palaces, and an enormous cuneiform archive on baked clay tablets was discovered. Thousands and thousands of tablets. And some highly intelligent guys got to work translating some of the texts. They could recognize the language. They were in Akkadian or Babylonian. And others were in unknown languages, but they soon were able to translate because they found a number of bilingual or trilingual texts. And after a while, after many decades of study, it was literally about 50, 60 years, most of the documents were translated. Certainly by about 1950, most of the documents had been translated. And it was discovered that these were the state archives of what is now called the Hittite Empire. And it was claimed that this was an empire forgotten to history, that the Greeks had known nothing of this great empire, this mighty kingdom that had fought against the Egyptians and beaten the Egyptians and Babylonians on a number of occasions. That the Greek historians had completely overlooked the existence of this people. Anyway, they discovered that the Hittites had employed a number of languages at their capital. And there were scribes there who were actually fluent in several languages and were able to compose texts in several languages. So the main language used in Hattusas was called Nesha or Neshili. And there was another language very, very prominent throughout the region, which was also represented in the archive, called Luwian or Luwanili. Now, the Nesha and the Luwian languages were closely related. And it was only discovered, it was recognized quite early, but certainly by the 1950s or 60s, that these languages were very, very closely related to the Lydian, the ancient Lydian language. Now, the Greeks had known about the Lydians. In fact, they wrote an awful lot about the Lydian Empire. King Croesus of Lydia was famous for the wealth that he commanded. As rich as Croesus was an expression used in Europe during the 19th century. And I think it came from the Greeks themselves. So the Greeks were well acquainted with a mighty Lydian empire, which had fought against the Medes and defeated the Medes on several occasions, and had challenged the rising power of Persia. King Croesus had actually attacked Cyrus the Great. The funny thing is that very little of this, now Lydian, the capital of Lydia, the Greeks said was Sardis. Now Sardis is near the coast of the Aegean, it's not on the coast. And the city of Sardis is there, but there's not much from it. There's a couple of burial mounds and not a great deal in terms of documentation has survived. A few alphabetic inscriptions using the Greek alphabet have been found, but nothing major. No indicators of this mighty empire, which the Greeks had said had dominated the entire region and had threatened the Mede and the Persian empires. So two of the languages were, and in fact, Nesha, the main language in Boghaskoy, Hattusas, is actually virtually identical to Lydian. It's a slightly archaic version of the Lydian language. So the Hittites, like the Mycenaean Greeks, were quickly dated in accordance with Egyptian chronology, the distorted measuring rod upon which has ruined the history of the entire ancient world. So they too were dated to, they were contemporaries of the 18th and 19th dynasties, so they were dated between the 15th and 12th centuries BC. Also, it was recognized that they were contemporaries of Mycenaean Greece. So among the documents, among the thousands of documents of cuneiform clay tablets found at Hattusas, they found many which mentioned names and towns and settlements in the Aegean coast, in the west of Turkey, familiar from Greek story and Greek history. There was Apassos, a city which was evidently Ephesus. There was Milawanda, which was Miletus, Milawanda. There was Wilios, which was one of the archaic Greek for Ilion or Troy, Ilios. The Greeks originally had a W at the beginning, so it would be Wilios in Homer's Greek. There was a prince of Wilios or Wilusa who was called Alexandus. And of course, Paris, who fled with Helen of Helen of Sparta to Troy, his other name was Alexandros. So they found Prince Alexandros of Wilius, or Wilusa, mentioned in one of the Boghazgoy texts. There was the Lucca people, the Lycians. There were numerous references to characters that appeared to have Greek names. There was a king of Achiawa. Now, I have to explain a bit here. In Homer's Iliad and Odyssey, the Greeks are never called Greeks, nor are they called Hellenes. The two names invariably given to the Greeks are Achiawa, Achaeans, and Danoi, Danans, okay? They're called alternatively Danans or Achaeans, Achiawa, okay? They're never called Greeks and they're never called Hellenes. These were names that were later adopted widely. Now, they found a prince of Achiawa mentioned in several of the documents, and his activities, which were warlike. This prince's name or king's name was was translated as Atreus. Okay, Atreus of Achiawa. He was active militarily. He had 100 chariots. And he attacked this. There's a document called, and this is an incredibly important document, and again, its true significance has been misunderstood and misrepresented and lost because of this distorted chronology. It's called the Indictment of Maduatas. Now, Maduatas, by the way, has a classic Lydian name, Madiatis. And the king of Hattushas is writing to Madiatis, who is clearly a prince on the Aegean coast. And he's reminding him of all the favors that the king of Hatti has worked for him, as how he has protected him, how he's restored him to his throne. And this document, the indictment, or the sins of Maduatas, it's called. It reminds Maduatas that when the king of Achiawa, Atarsias, advanced against you with 100 chariots, he says, it was my father, the king of Hatti, who restored you to your throne, who saved you from the destruction that was threatening you. Now, this document is dated to the time of a Hittite king called Tudhaliash. Now, for a long time, it was believed that this Tudhaliash, there were a number of Hittite kings called Tudhaliash. But it's now fairly clear that the Tudhaliash in question was the great-grandfather of the Hittite king Suppiluliumus. Now, Suppiluliumus was a contemporary of Akhenaten, the heretic pharaoh at the end of the 18th dynasty. So this was a document from the time of the great-grandfather of Suppiluliumus at the end of the 18th dynasty. So this document dated from near the beginning of the 18th dynasty, right? That's important. Now, remember, we saw that the grave burial, the grave circle burials in Mycenae dated from near the beginning of Egypt's 18th dynasty. 18th dynasty, early 18th dynasty objects were found in the grave circle beside these richly endowed bodies, okay? So this document dates to near the beginning of Egypt's 18th dynasty, the sins of Maduatas, it's called. Therefore, it's dated to around 1500 BC by conventional historians, and therefore 300 years at least before the accepted date of the Trojan War, which is supposedly around 1200 BC. Now, if we ignore the conventional dates, both for the Trojan War and for the 18th dynasty of Egypt, and if this document does date from near the beginning of Egypt's 18th dynasty, then it has to date, according to the chronology outlined by Gunnar Heinsohn and myself, it has to date to around 720, 730 BC, which is exactly where a whole host of other kinds of evidence would place the Trojan War. Now, how then do we reconcile the fact that Atreus, the king of Achaewa, the king of the Achaeans, could be King Agamemnon, the Greek king, who was waging a 10-year war against Troy, not only against Troy and her allies. Remember, this was a campaign carried out throughout the Aegean coast. It wasn't just popular idea is it was just the siege of one city. This was not the case. I remember reading, I think it was it Pope's translation of Homer? And near the beginning of the Iliad, Agamemnon is lamenting, 10 years have passed and they've got nowhere. And he's lamenting the lack of success of the Greeks. And he says, once great in arms, the common scorn we grow, repulsed and baffled, he says, by a feeble foe. But other forces have our hopes o'erthrown, and Troy prevails with armies not her own. In other words, the Greeks were not fighting just the Trojans, they were fighting all of the allies of the Trojans along the coast of the Aegean. So this was a wide-ranging war. This was a wide-ranging war that raged not just around Troy, but around the whole the Aegean coast of Turkey or Asia Minor. Okay, so in the Iliad, Agamemnon is rarely called Agamemnon. The name normally given by Homer to the king of Mycenae is Atreides, meaning the son of Atreus. Now, Atreus can clearly be a version of Atreides, the son of Atreus, or of the house of Atreus. And if this is the case, if this document does date from the time that the experts have dated it according to the internal linguistic evidence of the document, dates to the early Hittite Empire, early part of the late Hittite Empire and contemporary with Egypt's early 18th dynasty, and it dates to around 720, 730, then the Atreides of Achaewa, the king of Achaewa, who wages war against Troy's allies around the Aegean coast of Asia Minor, is indeed Agamemnon. And we possess a document actually mentioning a contemporary document actually mentioning King Agamemnon. Now, there's one further proof that this is correct, which is extremely important. In the same document, the Sins of Maduatas is called, a Greek ally of Atreus called Muxas is mentioned. Now, at the beginning, it wasn't clear who Muxas was, but he was obviously causing a great deal of problems for the Hittite Empire and Hittite allies around the Aegean coast and further south along Cilicia, along the southern coast of what is now Turkey, facing towards Cyprus. And it was only several decades after the translation of this document that it was proved beyond question that Muxas was Mopsus, one of the Greek allies of Agamemnon at Troy, mentioned by Homer and several other Greek authors. A bilingual inscription dating to the time of the Neo-Assyrian Empire was discovered at Kara Tepe in southern Turkey. And in the Hittite text, it mentioned that this particular prince claimed descent from Muxas. And in the Phoenician alphabetic, inscription, which was a translation. He was called Mupsas or Mopsas. So it was clear that Moksas of the Madhyatas text from the Hittite archives was Mopsus, the ally of Agamemnon. This is proof positive. Now, is it now admitted? Some of the most eminent classical scholars have admitted that the mention of this guy Moxos is proof beyond question. It says that is commonly regarded as the first absolute confirmation of the existence of one of the actual historical existence of one of the characters of Greek legend. I can't remember the name of the author who said this. Was it Kasky or I can't remember. But the full significance of this person is lost because of the chronology. Again, this Muxas is placed 300 years before what is believed to be the date of the Trojan War. So, of course, although this guy existed, he can't have been a contemporary of the Trojan War. And the King Atarasius, that he was an ally of Achaia, the king of the Achaeans, cannot possibly be Atreides, the king of the Achaeans who fought against Troy. But he was. So we have in our possession historical documents which prove, once the chronology is put right, these documents prove beyond question that the Trojan War is a historical event. I'm not saying every detail that Homer includes in his epic is historical. A lot of it is, most of it even, is clearly romanticized myth. Did it begin over the abduction of a princess from Sparta? I don't know. Right. It's possible, but that would have been an excuse for hostilities rather than the main cause. Did the gods personally intervene in the war to save one hero and destroy another? Well, that's just pure myth, and that's what ancient peoples did. They mythologized history, and then at a later period they historicized mythology, which is the opposite tendency.
Right.
So, in general, the further back you go, the less historical things get, and they become pure myth. But there was a period at which things are neither pure myth nor pure history. They could be called legend. And the Trojan War and the heroic age, the latter part of the heroic age of Greece is certainly part of that. As I say, many of the characters of that time and slightly later, who are recognized as absolutely historical, like Midas of Phrygia, nevertheless have mythical type elements attached to their story. Everything King Midas touched turned to gold. He grew donkey's ears because the god Apollo cursed him. And yet we know that he was a historical character, and we know he lived in the 8th century. And according to Homer, he was a contemporary and ally of the Trojan War.
So go ahead. I'm sorry.
Yeah, that's sorry. What was your question?
So it's Flinders Petrie that backdated the masks.
Yes.
And into what about the 15th century? You're saying?
Yes, and thereby spoiled early Greek history, ruined it.
As much as I read on this subject, I still don't understand why. Even in today's times, I mean, Petrie, I just pulled him up to make sure my dates are right. He was born in 1853 and he died in 1942. One of the most well-known Egyptologists / archaeologists around the time. He, along with the modern day Egyptologists and archaeologists, believe in the astronomical dating system. Why? That to me, if you're going to date Egypt in the Amarna period with moon cycles and the rising and setting of Sirius, to me, that's just preposterous. There are papers that come out even now that talk about a low and high chronology, which isn't tinkered with very much at all, and carbon dating. And the astronomical dating is always in these papers, which is a pseudo science. Point blank. It's not science. And allegedly, this comes from a 12th century document from Eusebius. I think it's Armenian, is what Scaliger used to validate this era.
Yeah.
I mean, come on. I mean, what are we doing here?
Yeah.
I don't even know what to say.
The problem, Sean, is modern academia. You're not dealing, when people think that when they're dealing with academics or scientists, they're dealing with pure evidence and facts. And that is not the case. You're dealing with human beings. You're dealing with egos. You're dealing with little ambitions and empires. The system of peer review and the system of research grants and tenure in universities ensures that nothing really new, really radical can ever get through. Because if you try to question the fundamentals, you won't get your PhD, because you're treading on too many toes. You're treading on the guys who are going to be judging your PhD, your paper, and your research will have published books which are based on the standard accepted ideology, which it really is, or the standard accepted paradigm or thesis. So you come along and you say, "Oh, this is all wrong." You start questioning the fundamentals. You're not going to get your PhD. You're not going to get grants. You're not going to get a tenured job. You're not going to get anything like this. You're going to be booted out, Right. So it's a system. It's a self-perpetuating system of power, which has got very, very little to do with respect for evidence or facts. I've found that in discussing these kind of topics, the most closed-minded people are the academics. Yeah. Right. The man in the street you can talk to, they'll listen, they'll find it interesting, they'll very often think, yeah, that's a good point. Academics will not even listen, mostly. They won't. As soon as you even mention the fact that the chronology could be wrong by a radical degree, that they'll just walk away. So right. We're dealing with human beings. Unfortunately, we're not dealing with facts. We're not right. dealing with evidence. We're dealing with egos. Yes, we're dealing with egos, and this is a big, big problem. It's the problem with the world. It's in every aspect of life, but it's in academia just as much. In fact, even more so. The one area where you would think that evidence and facts would be sacrosanct, would be important, would come first, is the last area.
Right.
It's terrible. It's a sad situation. So we haven't been able to uproot these accepted, by default accepted ideas. Nobody has ever been able to challenge them, not because of evidence or because of facts, but because of the power structure that's already there, which won't allow them to challenge it.
Right.
And it's a terrible situation. Yeah.
It leads into another question. So then the Trojan Wars are happening with the corrected chronology around the same time as what we would consider to be the Hyksos invasion of Egypt.
No, the Hyksos, fall of the Hyksos, not the invasion. Well, this is occurring at the fall of the Hyksos Empire, the Medes or the Mitanni. The Hyksos are the imperial Assyrians, not the Neo-Assyrians. They're a completely different thing. These are the old Assyrians. They are the imperial, the proper imperial Assyrians, and they're overthrown by the Mitanni, the Mita people, the Medes, and around 720, 730. And in the ruins of this giant empire, this Assyrian Akkadian empire, arise 18th dynasty Egypt, the Hittite kingdom, or Lydian kingdom as it rightly is, and the Mede the great Mede Empire, which stretches from Syria, Palestine to the borders of India, in fact, but which historians haven't been able to confirm its existence, of course, because they've been looking in the wrong century.
Right.
Yeah.
Right.
The Mitanni are placed 7 centuries before the historical Medes, so they can't find any evidence of the historical Medes. So that the Mede Empire has been consigned to oblivion now as well, just like the Trojan War, just like the Exodus of Egypt, just like everything. The whole of ancient history has been consigned to oblivion because of this absurd chronology. It's tragic.
Right. It's looked at more like legend than
Yes.
actual event.
Yeah.
And we've talked about this too, because it would lead to another question. And I know Steve Bennett mentioned this in a comment earlier. Modern archaeology claims 2 eruptions, 1470 and 1120. After listening to you guys, I suspect there was only one around 900 BCE. So the Bronze Age collapse that everybody's looking for between the Bronze Age and then the Iron Age is where the focus is when I download these academic papers in the first place. Do we have the evidence for Bronze Age collapse, Bronze Age catastrophe that leads us into the early Iron Age around 1100 BCE or so, give or take? Is that this is what the mainstream academics are standing on? Can we find that?
There was no Bronze Age collapse because the kingdoms of the late Bronze Age are actually the early Iron Age. The 18th dynasty and 19th dynasty are called the late Bronze Age, and they're supposed to have been conquered by, the end of this period is supposed to have been brought about by these mysterious sea peoples. But in fact, the 18th dynasty and the 19th dynasty belong between the 8th and the 6th centuries BC. The 19th dynasty comes to an end with the Persian invasion of Greece. There is no collapse except at the hands of the Persians. And this idea of a Bronze Age, of a late Bronze, there was, I suppose you could call it a Bronze Age, but it was a different epoch. There was an early Bronze Age, or early dynastic natural catastrophe, but there was no cataclysmic events after that. Now, the actual Bronze and Iron Age, they found, for example, let me explain this. In the shaft graves, the grave circle A, Schliemann found iron objects along with bronze objects. And this is regular, this is not unusual. A steel dagger was found in King Tutankhamun's tomb. So iron objects are quite commonly mentioned and a bit less commonly found, but they're found throughout the so-called Bronze Age. The Bronze Age and the Iron Age is an artificial differentiation. The Greeks themselves, Herodotus tells us when the Bronze Age, if we could call it that, comes to an end and the Iron Age begins. And according to Herodotus, it's the 6th century BC, not the 12th or the 11th. He tells a story of a war between Sparta, the kingdom of Sparta, and the kingdom of Tegea, which is also in the Peloponnesian Peninsula. The Spartans could not best the Tegeans. And anyway, they consult the oracle at Delphi, and the oracle says that you must find the bones of Orestes. Orestes was the son of King Agamemnon. And when you find the bones of Orestes, at that place you will find the key to defeating the Tegeans. So the Spartans send a couple of spies, and one of the spies in Tegea sees a man forging a sword of iron instead of bronze, right? And he's astonished. And he consults this guy, asks him what's he doing. He's making a sword from iron. And anyway, Herodotus places these events, this war between the Spartans and the Tegeans, in the reign was it Anaxandrides? I can't remember the name of the Spartan king, but it's a Spartan king, a historical Spartan king, who's recognized as living sometime in the 6th or late 7th century BC, right? So if we date the transition from Bronze Age to Iron Age, when iron then becomes the predominant metal used for weapon making, we're talking about the 6th century, which is the same century as the rise of the Persian Empire. Mm-hmm. Now, Herodotus mentions that many of the Persian soldiers, many of the soldiers from throughout the Persian Empire that King Xerxes brought into Greece still had bronze swords. So this idea that the Bronze Age was somewhat centuries before the historical times is nonsensical. Bronze and iron were used simultaneously for many centuries. If you can make bronze, you also have the technology to smelt iron. But there was a problem with mass production of good quality iron and steel. There was two problems, right? The main problem, the type of charcoal furnace used to smelt bronze will also smelt iron from ore down into a kind of a liquid pig iron, it's called. But the problem is the quality of iron ore has to be good, has to be very, very good. It's almost got to be almost pure iron in the rock. Otherwise, the iron ore, there's no amount of smelting will get usable iron out of it. Now, the one country in the ancient world with good quality, that type of good quality iron ore, was the Hittite land, or Tubal, as it's called, the Tubal Cain, as it's called in the Bible, the land of Tubal. The Hittites were the early manufacturers of good quality iron, from which good iron tools could be made, and then steel. Now, in the Iliad, Homer invariably says that the soldiers, the Trojan or the Greeks, they fell and they were cut down by the keen bronze. They were sliced by the keen bronze or pierced by the keen bronze of the spear. But once or twice he mentions iron swords, and these are regarded as anachronisms, but they're not, because Homer is living around the 6th century at that period of transition from bronze to iron. And his heroes in the Trojan War only live a few generations, 3 or 4 generations earlier. So there's already this transition happening. Now, if you can get very good quality iron ore, like the Hittites had, or the Lydians, shall we call them, you can produce good quality iron. It's called wrought iron. It's a black color. It doesn't rust really. It goes black. It's iron with high quality, high amounts of carbon that rusts. But pure iron or wrought iron has very little carbon in it, and it just goes a kind of a black. But wrought iron is not a good material for weapons, because it won't hold a blade as keen or sharp as a bronze sword. You can get a very, very sharp blade on a bronze razor or a bronze sword, and a less sharp one than one made of pure iron. You have to develop the technology then to make that iron into steel to make it an effective weapon. Now, steel production is not that hard either, if you know how to do it. It means heating the iron until it's red hot, and then plunging the iron into charcoal or some other carbon-rich material. Like in some cultures, the iron sword was heated red hot and then wrapped in a goat skin, and the carbon from the goat skin migrated into the surface of the iron, making a steel. It's called mild steel, I suppose, covering on the iron. You see, and this could then be sharpened to a very, very great, a very, very sharp blade. And that became the basis of the first steel swords. So steel swords, but when we talk about the Iron Age, we're talking about the time in which iron, or more properly steel, replaced bronze as the main weapon, as the main metal used in weapon making. But as I say, the two materials had been used simultaneously for centuries, with the iron gradually becoming more predominant as we go from the 7th into the 6th and into the 5th centuries. So it's a kind of a myth that there was no Bronze Age collapse. The Sea peoples were, in fact, Lycians, Carians, and Ionian Greeks, as Velikovsky proved very, very clearly in his epoch-making book, Peoples of the Sea. And the so-called major attack of the Sea peoples and the Peraset during the 20th dynasty, that's the time of Ramesses III, was in fact the attempt of the Persian king Artaxerxes II to reconquer Egypt in the 4th century after Egypt had gained her independence. And Ramesses II, or Ramesses III, was in fact the same as Pharaoh Nectanebo of that period. And he hired Greek mercenaries to help in his battle against the Persians. And the Persians also had vast numbers of Greek mercenaries in the ranks. So the Peraset that he illustrates on his great temple at, is it Deir el Medina? No. I can't remember the name of the place of the temple, the location of the temple eludes me at the moment. But anyway, he illustrated the great battles that he fought, and he defeated the forces of King Artaxerxes II. But what's notable about the soldiers on both sides is the absolute technical sophistication of their weaponry. They wear segmented armor like the Roman legionaries, Lorica segmentata. So it's mobile, flexible armor. The Peraset forces wear a classic Persian feathered crown. Now, this has been misinterpreted, of course, and so these Peraset have been called Philistines, which is nonsense. They're regular troops of the Persian great king Artaxerxes II. And where the paint in these bas reliefs has survived, it shows that the swords and the armor are painted a grey-green, which is steel. So they're using steel swords and steel armor. This is not in any kind of a Bronze Age. These are events of the period just before Alexander the Great. So it's the classical period. These events illustrate, which have been well recorded by the Greek historians. But there were marauding bands of Ionian Greek, Carian, Lycian, and Lydian mercenaries and sea raiders doing the rounds of the Mediterranean from the 6th, 7th century onwards. And Ramesses II defeated some of these guys, and he mentions in one of his inscriptions that no one could beat them initially. And he somehow managed to defeat a few of them. And he recruited some of these so-called sea peoples, or peoples of the islands, into his personal bodyguard, and he called them the Sardan. And again, the Sardan use weapons and equipment which is classically Greek. They carry the double-handled sword or shield, the apsis, which was developed by the Carians and the Greeks in the 6th century for defense for the phalanx. It was a particular battle technique used at that time, highly technical tactic, highly advanced tactic, the phalanx. And the phalanx was the hoplite warriors were secure behind the shield wall, which was held secure by this double-handled shield. Okay, so the soldiers they could present a stronger wall, with a double-handled shield, and the Greeks called this the apsis. So Ramses II's Sardan or Sardis mercenaries, who are clearly Lydians, are dressed like Greek hoplites, and they carry equipment typical of Greek hoplites of the 6th century. So, of course, they do wear a uniform which is peculiar to the mercenaries of that time, and they wear horned helmets. So again, this is, interpreted as, they belong to the 12th or 13th century BC, but this is nonsensical,
Emmet, we're gonna end soon, but there's some comments coming in from somebody called Do Not Comply, and this becomes light work for us. I'm gonna call it light work. I hate to say it that way. This guy is a skeptic about whole history, but he's not a skeptic about Persian Empire, but accept it as fact. So sad, the Achaemenians are unknown to local history. It's all Greco-Roman creation. Yes, you've heard it correct. Local history doesn't know the Achaemenian Empire. The Shahnameh is exactly written to count the region kings, but doesn't know if Achaemenids exist. The K Khosrow is a debunk. The K Khosrow being Cyrus is debunked. Everything found in Iran has the Iraqi Empire signature. Not a single unique artifact to a Persian civilization was found. It's literally like a ghost. Mm-hmm. We've talked about this on previous shows about the Persian Empire and the archaeology, which isn't difficult once you're putting the context of history in the correct chronology. Yeah. So Emmet, quickly, let's talk about the Persian satrapies and how they're supposed to be so rich, and they're very famous, but they're lacking archaeological evidence of their existence for the Persian kings.
This is a major problem, first highlighted by Gunnar Heinsohn. If you look at a book on Persian history, the Persian Empire, the Achaemenid Empire, it will show you monuments from Iran, from Persia proper, and nothing from outside that. There's no Persian monuments anywhere else in Syria, Palestine, in Egypt, in Turkey, and any of the regions that we know they control. Why? Because the Persians didn't use their Persian names. As kings of Syria, as kings of Iraq, as kings of Mesopotamia, they used Mesopotamian names. So the Neo-Assyrian and Neo-Babylonian kings that we call them, Sennacherib, Esarhaddon, Tiglath-Pileser, Nebuchadnezzar, Nabopolassar, these are the names that the Persian kings used as kings of Mesopotamia. They didn't use their Persian titles because their Persian titles would have been unpronounceable and meaningless to their Mesopotamian subjects. And so this explains the fact, as I say, Gunnar pointed out also that immediately underneath the Hellenistic layers, Alexander conquered these regions and set up a Hellenistic culture and civilization, the Seleucids and the Ptolemies in Egypt. But immediately under the Hellenistic layers, we find the Neo-Assyrian and Neo-Babylonian layers and no Persian layers. It's not because the Persians didn't exist. It's because the Neo-Assyrians and Neo-Babylonians are the Persians under the guise of local potentates and kings. So they're there, okay. They just have been misrepresented and misinterpreted.
Yeah, this stuff, it becomes, when you do the research into Gunnar Heinsohn and Emmet Sweeney, it becomes pretty simple to see that history is very distorted because of the chronology issues and because of the invention of the Neo-Assyrians, the invention of the Neo-Babylonians. That's what happens, and they're misidentified that way. They're not under their Persian names. They're under the names of then Assyrians, essentially.
Interestingly, even some conventional historians admit that Artaxerxes III, the penultimate Achaemenid great king, used the name Nebuchadnezzar because in the book of Judith, right, Judith cuts off the head, the biblical book of Judith. She cuts off the head of Holofernes, the general of a king Nebuchadnezzar. But we know from Diodorus of Sicily that the main general of Artaxerxes III was called Holofernes. Now, in the book of Judith, King Nebuchadnezzar also has a eunuch called Bagoas. And we know from Diodorus of Sicily that the chief eunuch of Artaxerxes III was called Bagoas. So yeah, even some mainstream historians admit that Artaxerxes III used the Babylonian name Nebuchadnezzar.
Right. Becomes pretty simple once we're using the archaeological strata, not the stories, so to speak. And that's where the conflict comes in. It's like we just talked about the Trojan Wars and what was romanticized or mythologized within that. Can it help? It'll take things out of context a little bit to where we think that they're just legends and they're just myths, essentially.
Yeah, basically. Yeah, I need to go now, Sean.
All right.
Right.
We're going to end it for today, but do not comply. We can always bring this up in another show. We can do a show about the Persians. I mean, we have a limited amount of information here. We can keep regurgitating and reiterating it over and over again. But the written sources, we don't throw them away, but we do question them on this show. And some of the sources are secondary sources. They aren't even primary sources. So we're agreeing in that sense, especially when you get into the AD chronology, that becomes a mess. It becomes a big mess. So we don't take history as laid out within the chronological sequence as it has been taught for centuries now. We rely on the comparative stratigraphy, the comparative architecture, and the science and technology of the times. And we always say it doesn't go backwards. It only should move forward with the science and technology. On that note, this was a really good show, Emmett. And again, everybody tune in. We'll have something cooking here very shortly. Thanks again, Emmett. Appreciate it.
Thank you, Sean.
Yeah. Hopefully we're off the air.
Switch this off here.
Oh, it didn't end. All right, it ended.